My name is Kush Choksi, and the Senior Vice President for Middle East and Central Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the U.S. Chamber and our affiliates in the region, the American Chamber of Dubai, American Chamber of Abu Dhabi, the American Chamber of Israel, we are honored to be co-hosting this event and joining our friends to celebrate tomorrow's signing of the historic Abraham Accords. The U.S. Chamber, together with its over 2,000 state and local chambers in the United States and 3 million companies, are the voice of American business. Mr. Minister, we have promoted this across America, and we are delighted to have you today. I'm also joined by my colleagues who run our respective programs, Steve Lutz, Vice President, who runs our U.S.-UAE business program, and Josh Cram, who are Executive Director of our U.S. Israel Business Initiative. Your Excellency, we have worked very closely with your predecessor and your ministry. We are most appreciative of the efforts of the UAE Embassy here, led by the Commercial Office, led by Saud and his team, for their outreach and efforts across countries and across programs. Without them, this event would not be possible. We have worked actively alongside our partners in the Emirates and in Israel and the private sector for decades to deepen and grow bilateral commercial ties. And of course, we could not have done that without our partners that are joining us today, the Federation of Israeli Chambers of Commerce, the Israel National Manufacturers Association, the Federation of UAE Chambers, with whom the Chamber enjoys an MOU, and the Abu Dhabi and Dubai Chambers of Commerce. We have about 700 people, Your Excellency, I believe, joining us today. This agreement between the UAE and Israel is a tremendous accomplishment and heralds the beginning of a new era in the Middle East, which we hope is not just marked by peace and security, but enhanced commerce, investment, and innovation. Please know the U.S. Chamber, in cooperation with our AmChams, the national chambers in the UAE and Israel, is committed to helping boost this dynamic trilateral relationship for the business community. We are preparing a robust program of engagement, drawing upon our deep business knowledge and connections in the UAE, Israel, and of course, home here in the United States. Just last week, Mr. Minister, and I want you to take this to your leadership in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the Israeli Minister of Energy, Minister Steinitz, when I hosted him for an event, said he looked forward to perhaps the United Arab Emirates joining the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, the EMGF. Just this March, before we broke off for COVID, we had the honor of hosting Minister Steinitz and Minister El Mola from Egypt. They were also joined by representatives from several other countries in the region. As the private sector entity on the EMGF's advisory committee, we would look to facilitate this effort if the UAE chose to join, either as a full member or as an observer. And across the spectrum of industries, there is so much more that we can do. Over the immediate future, we would look to convene events with yourself and your counterpart in Israel, hopefully, with ministers in ICT, health, and other areas with their counterparts in Israel. We have committed to doing this. For example, Your Excellency, you have led the Dubai Future Accelerator and the UAE efforts in creating the artificial intelligence strategy that you launched in 2017. We can explore jointly areas of collaboration on confluence between the Israeli and UAE private sectors, and the American private sector will be wholly part of this effort. And in the post-COVID era, next year, we are committed to bringing a business mission comprised of leaders from our 3 countries, the US, UAE, and Israel, to a business mission to UAE and Israel. It has been a dream of the Chamber for a long time to be able to start something like this in Abu Dhabi, move to Dubai, and then we'll move on to Tel Aviv. And then maybe given the ICT collaboration to the innovation centers maybe of Herzliya. As someone who has spent time in both countries intimately with the business communities in the UAE and in Israel, we look forward to doing so, and maybe this time on a direct flight on comfortable Etihad or Emirates. Again, thank you very much for doing this. We are honored, but this is only the beginning of a collaborative business relationship that we, together with our partners, the blessings of all three governments, look forward to leading on behalf of American business. Let me now turn it to Danny Seabright of the US-UAE Business Council for his remarks and introduction of His Excellency Minister Marri. Thank you.
Kush, thank you very much. Very much appreciate the opportunity to partner with you and Josh Cram today on this event in honor of His Excellency and his visit to Washington. Thank you first and foremost to Ambassador Al-Ateba and the UAE leadership, as well as longtime friends and colleagues in Israel for making this historic step for peace possible. It is this week in Washington about peace, and we could not be more proud and more supportive of what you all are doing. I want to give a big shout out to Saud Al-Nawais and his team at the UAE Embassy Trade and Commercial Office for conceiving and organizing this event, Mr. Minister. Saud and I worked together for over 12 years now, and in the early days when we worked with Sheikh Al-Lubna and I used to refer to Saud and his team at the UAE Embassy in Washington as the Dream Team. They are now your dream team, Mr. Minister, and you could not be more fortunate to have them on board. Saud's work in energizing this relationship, including what he accomplished on open skies and the 123 civil nuclear accords between our two countries, makes him ideally suited to help advise you on the next phase of the tremendous relationship between our two countries and this new trilateral journey that we're about to embark upon. I want to also give a great shout out and thanks to partnership with the U.S. Israel Business Initiative at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and our associate member AmChams in Abu Dhabi and Dubai for partnering on today's events. We are pleased that with these partnerships, we have, as Kush said, over 700 guests from across the UAE, Israel, and the U.S. on today's call. We're pleased to have many senior Emirati business and government partners in attendance, including the UAE Consul General in Los Angeles, His Excellency Haza Al-Kabi, UAE Consul General in New York, His Excellency Abdulla Al-Shaheen, the CEO of Invest Sharjah, His Excellency Mohammed Al-Mushar, and the CEO of the Dubai Chamber, His Excellency Hamad Bouamin, and folks from the Abu Dhabi Chamber as well. We're also pleased to have prominent Israelis in attendance. Dr. Yossi Drasnin, Director General, Israeli Ministry of Regional Cooperation, the head of Economic Department in the Israeli Prime Minister's Office, Yifat Alon Perel, the Minister of Economic and Trade Affairs in the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Consul General, Dr. Hillel Newman of the Israeli Consul in the Pacific Northwest. Consul General Nat Sultan Dadan, Israel Consul General of the Southeast, and Dorian Barak, founder of the UAE Israel Business Council. In addition, pleased to have many, many, many dear friends who are serving or served in the U.S. government. Victoria Coates, Senior Advisor to the Secretary, U.S. Department of Energy, and former Ambassadors Marcel Wahba and Ambassador Barbara Leaf, former U.S. ambassadors to the UAE. Finally, I'm pleased to have economic and trade representatives from at least 10 U.S. states: Alabama, Arizona, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, and Virginia. We have an intensive outreach along with the U.S. Chamber to broadening the UAE's reach across the United States, and these relationships and partnerships are very important. Tomorrow is not just an important day for the UAE, Israel, and the United States, and Bahrain, by the way, but it is a historic day with regard to the advancement of peace in the Middle East region. Tomorrow also means a lot to me personally, as I have spent much of my career working in Israel and the UAE and the wider Middle East, endeavoring to foster ties between Arabs and Israelis. Before taking over the helm of the U.S.-UAE Business Council, I served as a U.S. diplomat in our embassy in Israel and ran the Israel Count in Middle East policy at the Pentagon for 10 years. The U.S.-UAE Business Council has not wavered from its mission of promoting the bilateral trade and investment relationship between our two countries, Mr. Minister, when we were first created some 14 years ago, when His Highness Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed and His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed visited Washington, D.C. to meet with President Bush and to help kickstart the U.S.-UAE relationship following the Dubai Ports World controversy. In the last 14 years, as the bilateral business council between our two countries, we have grown our membership to over 200 of the top U.S. and importantly, UAE companies and I'm continually impressed by the UAE's visionary leadership in taking such bold and far-sighted steps in creating not only this council, but a number of bilateral business councils around the world, including the newly reconstituted UK-UAE Council, which is also on the call with you today. As the UAE and Israel consider what will be the most appropriate forum for their new business relationship, we stand committed to assist and advise from our experiences as appropriate. Many of our US member companies have significant business operations already well established in both Israel, in Herzliya, in Tel Aviv, and in Jerusalem, and in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Sharjah. There is a lot of US investment already deployed in both countries. Now that cooperation between Israel and the UAE is widely seen by all and open, our US and UAE member companies stand ready to help establish the early connective tissue that will be the basis of this new relationship. Mr. Minister, we're pleased to have you as our guest today, and I'm just gonna say a few words about you and your background before I turn it over to you for your opening comments and to do the Q&A. His Excellency Abdulla bin Touq Al Marri became Minister of Economy during the most recent UAE cabinet reshuffle in July this summer. Previously, he served as Secretary General of the UAE Cabinet, where he oversaw the functioning of the General Secretariat of the Cabinet, which supports all implementing decisions. Prior to this, His Excellency was Director General of the Executive Office of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum and oversaw the Hatta Development Project, among other key projects. He was also involved in the creation of the Area 2071 project, the relaunch of the Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Leadership Development, the Arab Strategy Forum, and the Mohammed bin Rashid Arabic Award. His Excellency notably served as interim CEO of the Dubai Future Foundation and oversaw the launch of Dubai 10X, the second and third cohort of the Dubai Future Accelerator and the UAE Artificial Intelligence Strategy. He is, in short, a Renaissance man, a perfect example of the type of visionary, forward-looking leadership that has distinguished the UAE and made a mark on the country and the wider region. Your Excellency, I've done a little homework on you, and I also understand that you're a world-renowned nature photographer, and that in your spare time, which I'm not sure what you have or how you do it, that you have photographed many interesting locales around the world. We would like to hear about that at some point in your remarks as well, and that you're a proud father. All of these are important to making you, as I said, the Renaissance man that you are. With that, Your Excellency, thank you very much. I turn it over to you to make any opening remarks that you might like to make, and then I will start with some Q&A. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Danny, for the introduction. Thank you, Kirsch, and thank you, Josh, as well, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for coming in for this Business Council meeting. And I think it's important to address everyone today. I'd like to thank my two co-hosts for today for event, the UAE U.S. Business Council and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and this Israel U.S. Business Council. It's a great honor for me to be here with you today as part of the UAE delegation for the UAE Israel Peace Accord. This agreement will normalize relations between the UAE and Israel. As you know, the United States played an instrumental role in brokering the accord, and it will be a joint effort to realize the promise that peace offers to our three nations, the Middle East and beyond. The founding father of the UAE, the late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, once said, "Future generations will be living in a world that is very different from that to which we are accustomed. It is essential that we prepare ourselves and our children for that new world." Today, we are starting on a journey that we must all take together towards a future of peace, stability, and hope, of a better life for our people and our region. And that's why I think it's so important for me to be here speaking with business leaders such as yourself, as we need to play a major role in advancing this vision of the future. The agreement will pave the way for greater trade and investments, a peace dividend. As more trade is conducted and more investment is executed, this relationship will only strengthen. More businesses means more people-to-people connection, more understanding, and more shared interests. Along those lines, Israel and the UAE will open their economies to another, allowing goods, services, and investment to flow across our borders. We will host exchanges of scientists, executives, students and academic experts, religious leaders, and tourists. Together, we will see COVID-19 treatments and cures, reliable food and water supplies, and increased standards of living for ourselves and people across the globe. The prospects of added trade and commerce between Israel and the UAE are exciting for both countries. Two of the most innovative and advanced economies in the region, if not the world. Our two young countries share common values with the United States when it comes to entrepreneurship and investing in our people. The UAE and Israel are the largest trade partners for the US in the region. We are two of the largest economies in the region, the richest and most connected. Let me give you just a few key pieces of data. The UAE is the largest export destination for the US goods and services in the Middle East, amounting to more than $24.4 billion last year alone, and that number is sure to grow after the agreement is put into place. The UAE and Israel are two of the largest economies in the region. In 2019, the UAE GDP was $421 billion, and Israel was $395 billion. The UAE ranked 5th in the world for GDP per capita, $74,000, and Israel ranked 35th at $39,000. The World Bank Group, ranking on ease of doing business, put the UAE at number 16 on the list and Israel at 35. DHL and New York University Stern School of Business Global Connectedness Index, which highlights the key developments in international flows of capital, trade, information, people, places the UAE at number 5 and Israel at 17. Think about the power of these economies. Imagine what is possible now that we'll be trading and working with one another. Israeli media reports indicate that Israeli exports to the UAE could quickly jump to from 300 to 500 million annually and perhaps more, and UAE investments in Israel could be as much as $350 million a year. Already we have seen these benefits of peace. The first flight from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi landed on August 31st, and Saudi Arabia graciously opened its airspace for such commercial flights, and Bahrain soon followed. And we are seeing reports that Israeli firms have signed deals with Emirati counterparts, and we anticipate a host of joint ventures in almost all sectors. But we cannot take this moment for granted. Opportunity is knocking, and we must open the doors. We must seize the moment, and I hope to hear from you and others in the business community about what you think is possible, what we can build together. But in the meanwhile, there are several sectors that I see as immediate priorities for next-term exploration and collaboration. On the aviation and shipping, in the short term, the sector has suffered a setback due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the corresponding impact on the airline and travel industry. But as the world recovers from this current crisis on the commercial aviation front, the opportunities are boundless. With several of the leading airlines in the world based in the UAE and Israel, the biggest winner will be passengers. With the introduction of direct flights, there's possibility for future code-share agreements between El Al, Israeli national carrier, and Emirates and Etihad, as well as enhanced competition for many routes that continue to Asia and Africa, generating more choices, lower rates, and fares for travelers in both countries. Low-cost carriers such as Fly Dubai and Air Arabia could also play a significant role in facilitating traffic to and from both countries. We can further grow and connect our logistics hubs. Dubai International Airport is the world's busiest airport for international passengers and a leader in air cargo. As Emirates Sky Cargo has expanded its network to over 100 scheduled destinations, Jebel Ali Port is the largest seaport in the Middle East. This capacity has a potential to now be connected to Israel, both Haifa, which can handle roughly 29 million tons annually, as well as Port Ashdod and Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. On the space, the UAE just recently launched the Hope program to Mars, inspired by the region and the world during these challenging times for a country whose space agency has only been around since 2014. The Hope probe itself was an incredible accomplishment. The Israeli space program, having been around much longer, is a vibrant and multifaceted. Israeli program is very much intertwined with its broader technology sector, leveraging a strong position in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Renewable energy. On renewable energy, Israel is more than 1.4 gigawatts of solar power capacity. The UAE is home to the second largest solar power plant in the world, as well as the International Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, the first UN arm located in the Middle East. Israeli companies are developing new technologies that UAE could either invest in or adapt to. Those new technologies include solar thermal plants, improved lithium-ion batteries, hydrogen storage, smart grids, solar generation, balancing biofuels, and floating solar power. Masdar, the Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company, recently announced it will acquire stakes in 8 clean and renewable energy projects led by the EDF Renewables in North America. This is the type of collaboration that the UAE and Israel can now pursue confidently with their mutual benefits. The UAE expertise in solar and Israeli expertise in water hold potential for trade, investment, collaboration between our nations. On water, of course, it's a critical issue for both nations. Because of our shared geography, the UAE has quite a bit to learn from Israel, which is home to the world's largest water desalination plant and more than 300 startups working on water technology. On food security, the UAE has dedicated food security office and the Minister of State for Food Security, as well as National Food Security Strategy 2021, in addition to trade and agriculture to and from both countries. Additional collaboration could take place on the agtech side, such as further developing the concept of vertical farming. I could go on with providing many examples. Prospects for the region have never looked better. But to realize the full potential of this moment, we need you, our American friends and partners, to join us. Together, we can help grow our economies, create new prosperity for ourselves, our neighbors, and most importantly, we can daily recommit ourselves to make peace endure. Thank you very much. And lastly, I think, Danny, about the photography part, I think we can do some photography trips and expedition for nature photography in Israel. And this is something that I haven't touched before. For the last 5 years, I haven't touched my camera, being busy with all the projects I've been working on.
Mr. Minister, I lived in Israel for 3 years. I've traveled there extensively from the north to all the way to the south, and I can tell you your camera lens is going to be delighted by what it sees when you visit Israel. Absolutely delighted.
Then I'm going to take my camera with me when I visit Tel Aviv.
Absolutely. Beyond Tel Aviv, sir. You have to get out and visit widely in the country for sure.
I'll leave the trip itinerary to you, Danny.
Okay.
Take you there for sure, Mr. Minister.
Mr. Minister, you answered one of my 3 questions, but I was able to put together a third one really quickly. But importantly, what I want to start with is to set the stage for particularly our American friends that are on, our Israeli friends and American friends both in the UAE and in the US. Your government did go through quite an extensive reorganization this summer. You were appointed into the position. I think we now have 3 senior ministers or 3 ministers at the Ministry of Economy, you being the top one with 2 others reporting to you. Could you take a moment for everyone and walk us through how the new ministry is organized, what your beyond obviously the Israel moment that we're in right now, the moment with Israel. Just what are your goals and objectives for the ministry going forward? How you're going to organize it internally at home, and how you're going to face internationally and outward, so that our member companies and the folks on the line today know how to engage and know what your priorities will be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. I think if we take a step back and look at the reshuffle of government that happened on the July 5th, I think it's important to understand that His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum have decided to really relook into the economy. He didn't really invested in 3 ministers in the Ministry of Economy, but he actually had 5. We are 3 in the Ministry of Economy, myself and my colleague, His Excellency Dr. Thania Ziyudi, the Minister of Foreign Trade, and His Excellency Dr. Ahmed bin Hol, Minister of State for Entrepreneurship and SMEs. As well, we look at the Minister of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, the Minister of Manufacturing and Advanced Sciences. And as well, we look at Umar Al-Ulama, Minister of State for Digital Economy. So when we look at that, that shows you that the UAE government have invested a lot on the aspects of the future of economy. When you have advanced manufacturing, advanced technology, digital economy, we have foreign trade and entrepreneurship, that really sets aside the objectives of what the government of the UAE initially thinks about. Reorganizing the ministry as well onto that level is important. We are at the moment currently working together to create the right councils, with including all the Department of Economical Development departments and local governments. We're working closely as well with the Chambers of Commerce. We sat recently with all the businessmen in the UAE. We sat with communities in different areas to understand, to listen. And we are on a fact-finding mission to understand what are the policy, the legislation that we need to work with to have more of an adaptive and agile economy that can help us to be more adaptive in the future. This is what COVID-19 has accelerated in us. And I think it's important to focus on it in the future. An agile government, an agile economy, an agile mindset as well is an important part.
Mr. Minister, you've had quite a lot of experience in working in some of these most advanced, if you will, applications of STEM and science and tech, and what you've done in Dubai. Can you say a few more words about what you'll do to bring that to the Ministry of Economy? How will that focus your efforts there? Just want to make sure that folks really understand what are the opportunities in engaging with your new ministry and with yourself.
I think it's important to any government in the world to understand that the job is not just on government. And I think it's important that focus on 5 key players and stakeholders that really focus on creating an ecosystem in any government. And I think number 1 is government, let's put that on the side. But the second one is important to bring the science community, the universities into place as well. They need to bring up as well and help government to understand what's happening. The other part is venture capitalists, risk capital. It's an important stakeholder and shareholder as well with us to help us understand and create an ecosystem in the UAE. Third one is large companies and large corporations, not to forget that actually they are hugely invested in the future of economy. And last but not least is the entrepreneurs. I think these are the 5 fundamentals, pillars when we look at any economy, and we need to sit with all 5 of them. We need to speak, we need to talk, we have to have a dialogue, a strategic dialogue in understanding and creating these economy and an ecosystem for the UAE. That's how we're going to approach it, that's how we're going to tackle it further, and this is why we are here today.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We've taken delegations from Sharjah, from Dubai, with Consul General Shaheen, with Saud, to Research Triangle in North Carolina, out west to Silicon Valley. And this trifecta, or this triangulation, if you will, between government, academia, and business is critical for the future and critical for your future development. Israel's done a good job of this as well, and I know that this is a big focus of what you're trying to do in the future, and we look forward to trying to work with you as much as we possibly can on that. Mr. Minister, I have to raise a real quick question. China is going to vex the U.S. government, no matter who is in charge after November in our country. Our relationship with China and our relationships with other countries in the world, and how we deal with them and our relationship with China is going to be a huge challenge in the years ahead. Just wanted to ask you if there's anything, I know you're relatively new in the job, is there anything you want to offer with regard to the UAE, Israel, China, US cooperation in the future, because the Israelis have a long history of also cooperating with China?
I think it's important to shed the light that UAE works collectively on a strategy. We are currently working on post-COVID-19. We have launched very recently a 33 initiative. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's something that we bring a plan together to really get out of this, because we are really stuck at the moment, not just the UAE, but I think globally. COVID-19 have created an overcast of us to really reignite the economy in a different ways and different manners. I think it's important to look at. So our 33 initiatives focuses more on the current ramification of the economy. It's really sure that the current economical mix of GDP needs to be re-looked at. I don't think the UAE GDP would look the same today than it looks 10 years down the line. And I think looking at that, it's important to look at trade relations. How can we reach a different economical mix with our partners globally? And that's a very important aspect in our strategy. The 33 initiatives has created as well a recovery. We have a UAE recovery committee. I chair that committee, and we have members from the local government, from the private sector on it, and they are here to help us as well to understand how can we go and beyond borders to understand that the recovery doesn't really focus the UAE, it goes globally. We need to really put our hands together to really understand how can we bring the economy back on track. I haven't been lucky to be assigned on the 5th of July, let me tell you that. I came in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis. It couldn't be better, but it gave me resilience and agility and agileness as well. And this is something that really I bring back into this aspect.
Thank you, sir. Last question, and I'm turning it over to Josh, and that is, we've been asked to ask you your thoughts on the creation of an Israel UAE Business Council. Obviously, our lane, that what we do is the US UAE business work. But folks have asked, what's your thinking on how you will create that business partnership, that bilateral business partnership between Israel and the UAE? And you mentioned it a little earlier, but the proper role for the US and all of that.
I think we're looking not just on that. We're looking at eight different agreements will path the way forward. I think we're looking at double taxation agreement. We're looking at the aviation sector, and for a business council to happen, the procedure. Yes, yet I'm new at this pause. I'm playing a new member card on the cabinet, but I can tell you that I think it goes through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. And from that, we are very welcoming to create a UAE Business Council approach to it. And we can take it further into a trilateral, or we can go into a JEC as well, a joint economical committees, and we can do that on the later stages as well. So we are very welcoming to any agreements that comes into place.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Turn
Mr.
it over
Minister.
to Josh Cram.
I will now turn it over to my colleague, Josh Cram, who runs our U.S. Israel Business Initiative, to ask the next three questions. But I do want to tell you, Mr. Minister, on an Israel-U.S. Business Council, we've talked about it. You may recall about 10 years ago, the U.S. Chamber formed and launched the U.S.-UAE Business Council that Danny now heads. And we would be, of course, happy to take a leadership role in that effort. But if I may, Josh will speak to three questions in a minute, but the space program, renewable energy, and water are three areas we've worked on extensively. As you know, Israel has particularly very good skill sets in those areas. And I think there's a confluence. Recently, we hosted the UAE Space Agency right before the Hope Mars launch. So we learned about what the UAE was doing with our members there. And I think there is a real confluence of interest. Josh, can you tell us a word or two about our Israel program and then lead into your three questions? Thank you.
Mr. Minister, it's great to be with you, albeit virtually. Welcome to Washington. I really do hope you are able to get out and see the great city that you're in while you're here. I know this is your first trip. Congratulations on this major accomplishment. This is an unbelievable undertaking, and you're really at the front of this. As you were talking, there's so many commonalities in terms of these two dynamic, robust innovation economies. And as Coach said, we look forward to being supportive. You know, for many, many years, we've run the U.S. Israel Business Initiative here at the Chamber, and it's been the platform to promote and advance the strong commercial relationship between our two countries. We have terrific partners in Israel, the AmCham, the Manufacturers Association, the Federation of Israeli Chambers. And, you know, I think our relationship with Israel looks a lot like the relationship with the UAE, and there's really some trilateral opportunities here. When I told my friends in Israel that I would be asking you a few questions, I know that there's a huge amount of excitement about these agreements in Israel. And so I tried to pull three questions from some of our friends to pose to you. The first question is from Oded Rose, the CEO of the Israel America Chamber of Commerce, our affiliate in Israel, who said, Israel and the UAE are the US's two biggest trading partners, which you alluded to, in the Middle East. Both the UAE and Israel are known as innovation hubs globally. Both have attracted a wide range of US companies and investors. Where do you see the trilateral business opportunities coming out of this trilateral political agreement?
I see it more in the sectors that I mentioned, especially in the agtech, the space, the future technology, the new economies of the world. I think that's what we need to look at. I think the fourth industrial revolution used to be theoretical last year. Today is practical. I think we need to advance more into that aspects. So that's what we probably will start off with. And I think that's something we both countries, all countries, US, UAE and Israel, have advancement in it. I think we can come together, advancing the fourth industrial revolution, creating jobs, acquiring future skills for our nations. And I think that's something that we can work in heavily.
Great. And another question that came up from a friend, Tali Zinger, who's managing director of Blue Laurel, who's an American Israeli who's actually lived in Dubai, one of the very few, spends a lot of time across the GCC. She said to most Israelis, the Emirates is kind of a blank slate. There's been little interaction, and there's much that Israelis can learn about the UAE. How would you advise the Israeli business community or Israeli business executives? How can they identify the right partners in the UAE to help grow, both in the UAE and across the region? And how can companies understand the pros and cons of working in each of the Emirates? I think, folks are aware that there's Dubai and Abu Dhabi, but there are others. And so how can you kind of give guidance to companies? And let me start with actually a Hebrew word. When we take groups to Israel, I like to, on the bus, give them a Hebrew word of the day. And so I go with the word tachlis. So if you haven't learned that word yet, I'm sure you'll be in Tel Aviv soon enough, and you'll hear that a lot. But it's really sort of brass tacks, bottom line. How can I navigate the UAE market as an Israeli company?
I think in the UAE, we're very fortunate of leaders that have created a lot of visions and strategies. I think if all businesses community can look up and they can search them on Google, like Danny searched me up, I think it's important to look at what are the visions and strategies that are available. Every emirate has its strengths and they can work together to advance their interest in. Yes, we have Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but like you said, there are other emirates who has other advancements and opportunities as well can all come together. The other fold to it as well, I think the chambers of commerce in every emirate can really help and guide businesses as well where to go and how to actually establish. And the third one is my office is always open. I can always help and guide as well businesses and business community wherever they want to really interests are and open doors for them to actually meet and build their business models.
That's terrific. Another question I have, the last question is from Dan Katarivas, who's the Director General of the Foreign Trade Administration at the Israeli Manufacturers Association, which is the largest business organization in Israel. Danny said, "We see huge complementarities between Israel and the UAE, and we greatly look forward to developing strong win-win relationships with your country. How does the UAE advance trade with its global partners?" You alluded to double taxation treaty and some of the 8 different agreements that I think are under works. Do you foresee negotiations forthcoming on a UAE-Israel free trade agreement?
Yes, I think that's something that's one of the 8 actually. An FTA is something that is on the top, but we need to understand as well in the UAE, we are bound to the GCC customs as well and agreements. And that needs to be worked on and find the differences that we can actually work together with. But let's start with the BIT, the bilateral one first.
Josh, thank you. And Kush, thank you. Saud has asked me to wrap it up. And I'm going to do so, Mr. Minister, by asking you the last question here as a way of summarizing your remarks. Something that I ask every senior Emirati leader on these calls. You have children. This is a moment of great hope, great vision, and great opportunity. How do you talk to your children about this this moment that's happening? What do you say to them? And in that same regard, what keeps you up at night, and what do you worry about when you think forward in your new position? Those are 2 things that you can put together and make a very positive answer to for the end. Thank you, sir.
I think when I had a talk with my daughter before coming over here, I told her I'm going to see Donald Trump and I'm going to the White House, I'm going to sign this. And she was very, very excited. She has no information about history and what happened, but what she really hoped with is she was very happy. And this is something that we all bring into our kids. We had 2 years ago, the UAE had the year of tolerance. We had leadership in the aspect of tolerance. We had the Minister of tolerance in the UAE. We have 195 nationalities living in the UAE with different faith. And I think it's important that we bridge on that, because we educate our kids about tolerance and how can we live together. And our culture is very welcoming. And I think that's the most important part in our region, in our work and how we do it. And I think that's something which is I shed the light on and ask everybody to talk about, and especially to the kids. Peace is the most important part in the stability of the Middle East. And this is something that we need to work on. On what keeps me at night, it's something about very relative COVID-19. So something that, how can we bounce back? Are we going to see, at the moment, are we going to see a V, a W, a U, an S? I'm not sure what type of alphabet we're going to see, but something that really we need to crunch the data, understand how can we really rebound faster as ministers of economy, the five of us. And I think it's important to work closely in the UAE to really bring back the economy on stage again, especially under this year and next year as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the U.S. Chamber's Israel Initiative, to Josh and to Kush. Very much appreciate the partnership today. Mr. Minister, congratulations again, and mabruk for the big event tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much. If you walk in Washington, we ask you to walk across from the White House is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I have to share a moment of history. In 1979, the day after the Camp Davis Peace Accords, President Carter, President Sadat came across to the chamber to launch our Egypt program. We are in a COVID environment, but I invite your leadership and together we will ensure that the Israeli leadership, the American leadership is there to be able to celebrate and launch this trilateral partnership once again in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kush. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Danny, and have a lovely day. Thank you very much.